Good afternoon. This joint hearing for the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations, and the Subcommittee on Civil Rights and Civil Liberties will come to order. I note that a quorum is present, and without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. We are meeting today to hear testimony examining global religious persecution with a specific focus on the laws that criminalize religious minorities and secularists. People should not be victimized because of their beliefs, and government should not make them conform on the basis of those beliefs. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. I recognize myself for the purpose of making an opening statement. I would like to thank our witnesses for coming and shedding light on this much-needed topic. I would especially like to thank Rashan Abbas, who will be telling her personal story, and Rachel Deutsch, who will read the testimony of Rafida Bonya Ahmed. Recently, we have been hearing stories of how China is persecuting religious groups, particularly the Muslim Uyghurs and Christians. There are reports that China is forcing Muslims into re-education camps and requiring them to eat pork and drink alcohol. This is a clear human rights violation, and the international community must put pressure on China to deter this behavior. The mistreatment of the majority Muslim Rohingya is simply devastating. The atrocities that have been committed against the Rohingya people by the Burmese security forces, including mass killings and sexual violence. They have been mistreated and repressed for decades under the continual Burmese government and have yet to be given citizenship under the 1982 Citizenship Law. This makes them one of the largest displaced populations in the world and limits their access to basic human rights. People of all faiths are being persecuted for their beliefs all over the world. In Africa, most African constitutions guarantee the freedom of religion, but there have been recent regressions in West Africa, particularly Nigeria, and the Lake Chad Basin due to the footprint of Boko Haram and in the Central African Republic. There are many other state actors who inhibit their citizens' religious freedoms, and the international community must continue to shed light on these ongoing human rights violations and make governments accountable. My colleagues and I want to further understand the various types of persecution that can afflict different faiths in various regions in the world. And we hope this hearing will help encourage more thorough research on the problem so we can shape policy that combats religious persecution. I now recognize the ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee for the purpose of making an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I thank you again for bringing us together for this important hearing. And of course, Mr. Raskin, thank you as well. You know, about 40 years ago, during my first term in Congress, I read Torture for Christ by Romanian pastor Richard Wurmbrand. It is the true story of unspeakable physical torture and psychological abuse of underground Christians under Romania's dictator Nicolae Ceausescu, and Pastor Wurmbrand's harrowing 14-year incarceration. I was moved to tears when I read it. Like so many, I was inspired by Pastor Wurmbrand's indomitable faith, breathtaking courage and hope, and challenged by his admonishment to believers to cease enabling evil by naivete, cold-hearted indifference, or cowardly complicity. After being drugged and beaten, Pastor Wurmbrand said he was in such bad shape, he even forgot the words to the Lord's Prayer. My first religious freedom mission, Madam Chair, was to Moscow and Leningrad on behalf of Soviet Jews in 1982. During that trip and during many other subsequent trips, and we certainly met with the leading refuseniks, as they were called at the time, Jews who were told, you must leave. You can't leave, I should say. If you do, you'll go to prison or lose your job. And yet, they wouldn't let them get an exit visa. It was absurd. And I began to really grasp Alexander Solzhenitsyn's astute observation that communism doesn't merely believe that God does not exist, it hates him. He called it militant atheism. So we're here today to focus on persecution on the basis of religion worldwide. This is a phenomenon that has several wellsprings. We know how an atheistic communist state, such as Xi Jinping's China, persecutes religious believers, the mass incarceration of the Uyghur and Kazakh Muslims, and Rabia Kadir, I believe, I saw her outside, her entire family and extended family is incarcerated in Xinjiang. She and like the other Muslims, many of whom have been rounded up and put in concentration camps, they not only incarcerate individuals, they incarcerate entire families, and that's all because of Xi Jinping. We know that the Falun Gong practitioners have also been repressed in horrific ways. Tibetan Buddhists and Christians have come under increasing assault, including the bulldozing of their churches. North Korea, Vietnam, and Cuba all fall within this category of state persecutors of religion. We see, too, religious persecution in some Muslim countries where Sharia law conflicts with the principle of equal protection of the law. The inherent inequality is evident in the domestic relations in places like Egypt, where a Coptic Christian who marries a Muslim is afforded less rights in matters such as inheritance, custody, and divorce. We see it in countries such as Pakistan, where blasphemy laws have been weaponized, and people such as Asia Bibi has suffered so intensely. We also should remind everyone that this committee and this Congress has repeatedly spoken out on behalf of the persecution of Rohingya Muslims in Burma and the role played by Buddhist extremists in fomenting hatred against them. Indeed, I am personally saddened, and I'm sure all of us are, by the acquiescence in this persecution by Aung San Suu Kyi, a Nobel laureate on whose behalf many of us advocated when she was a political prisoner. In Sri Lanka, we see ethnic and religious-based discrimination by the Sinhalese Buddhist majority against religious and ethnic minorities. In India, under the government of Modi, as well as by his BJP party and the RSS movement, there is the promotion of Hindu ideology, where we see in India, which sees India as a Hindu state, contrary to its secular constitution. Let me remind people that the only person who was not provided a visa when he asked for one under the International Religious Freedom Act was, well, who is now the president of India, Modi. We also see it in non-state actors, such as Boko Haram and ISIS, who engage in jihadi murder of non-believers and even Muslims who believe differently from them. Let me just remind, and the chairwoman is very aware of this, as am I, and we've had hearings on this in the past. There's increasingly a factor in Nigeria that is a very bad trend, where the Fulani are targeting Christians for death, and that needs to be met with the outrage that it so justly deserves. So again, I want to thank my dear friend for calling this hearing. We need to continue the focus. Back in 1998, the International Religious Freedom Act was backed by the Congress and signed into law. I held all the hearings on it. There was pushback at the time. Some people didn't want it, but it became law. It was Frank Wolf's legislation. In 2016, I wrote the law to expand it, to strengthen it, and that's called the Frank Wolf International Religious Freedom Act, and we could get into it a little bit later, but many of those provisions are being now faithfully implemented by the Trump administration and especially by the ambassador at large for religious freedom. We have much to do. Unfortunately, people of faith are under siege. Yield back.
I'd like to invite the chair of the Subcommittee on Civil Rights and Civil Liberties for his opening statement.
Madam Chair, thank you very much, and I do want to salute you for your extraordinary leadership on matters of human rights and development and civil rights and civil liberties and especially press freedom. So thank you for convening us today. It's a pleasure to be with Mr. Smith and all of our colleagues who've come together, and welcome to today's witnesses. At a time of sharp partisan division in our country, it's my hope that in coming together in this hearing, we can agree across party lines that America should be leading the demand to end the escalating religious persecution that we see all over the world today of people because of their religious faith, their identity, and their beliefs. The defense of religious freedom and pluralism is fundamental to who we are as Americans. Our founders broke from centuries of religious warfare, the wars between the Catholics and the Protestants in Europe, and theocratic oppression, the Holy Crusades, the Inquisition, the witchcraft trials in the colonies, in order to create a constitution and a republic that would make it safe for people to freely practice any religious faith they wanted or none at all. But today, dozens of governments around the world, some of which are American allies that receive our aid, are harassing, persecuting, incarcerating, and executing people because of their religious faith, their religious identity, and their religious beliefs. No one and no group is safe from the rising new wave of religious intolerance, fanaticism, and oppression taking place across the world. In China, millions of Uyghur Muslims have been forced into ideological re-education camps. In Burma, violent oppression of Rohingya Muslims by the Buddhist military has turned nearly genocidal. 1 million Rohingya Muslims were forced to flee their homes to refugee camps in Bangladesh and faced ethnic cleansing, mass killings, gang rape, and torture. India recently passed a Citizenship Act that has human rights groups deeply anxious that it will leave Muslims living in India without a state and lead to broader scapegoating, violence, and persecution. Russia's accelerating crackdown on Jehovah's Witnesses as an extremist group ended in total prohibition on practice of their faith in Russia, the seizure of church property, and the jailing of adherents. Pakistan is one of the worst offenders today. Under their blasphemy laws, at least 40 people are currently sentenced to death or serving life sentences. Ahmadi Muslims in Pakistan are prohibited from obtaining state identification without renouncing their religious convictions. Forced conversions of non-Muslims are not uncommon in Pakistan, despite the passage of contravening laws. This is a misery for the people who are affected by it. Bonya Ahmed, who was to testify today but fell ill, seriously ill, and could not attend, survived an assassination attempt in Bangladesh in which her husband, Avijit Roy, was targeted and killed by machete-wielding thugs for his secularist writings while Bangladeshi police stood by and did nothing to stop them. Asia Bibi, a poor Catholic farmer in Pakistan, who the world rallied behind when she was sentenced to death by hanging for blasphemy, defended Christianity in argument with her neighbors and was persecuted ever since. She was jailed for more than 8 years and was only released after an intense global pressure campaign when she fled to Canada. Miriam Ibrahim was a Sudanese Christian who was jailed for alleged apostasy because although she'd been a Christian all her life, government officials demanded that she should have followed her absent father's religion. Instead, she was held in jail with her 20-month-old son and forced to give birth to her daughter while her legs were shackled to the floor. The Christian governor of Jakarta, Indonesia, known as Ahok, was jailed for 2 years on blasphemy charges for allegedly insulting the Quran during his re-election campaign, and so on. According to the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, more than 24 countries are now designated countries of particular concern because of their theocratic laws, religious discrimination, violence, and intolerance. And as a group, these countries are equal opportunity violators. They persecute Christians, Muslims, Hindus, Jews, atheists, agnostics, secularists, and other religious dissenters under the so-called heresy, blasphemy, apostasy, witchcraft, and sorcery laws. The touchstone is religious or intellectual departure from a governing state orthodoxy. Alleged thought crimes in these societies can result in seizure of property, mob violence, indefinite imprisonment, and in many cases death, either by direct governmental action or passive complicity with mobs and vigilantes who take the law into their own hands. The fight for freedom of religion around the world today is part of the struggle to defend democracy in countries ruled by autocrats, tyrants, despots, and old-fashioned theocrats. America must reassert its leadership as the world's first constitutional democracy to defend the freedoms of speech, expression, and religion against official persecution anywhere and everywhere that people's rights are threatened. And with that, I'm happy to yield back, Madam Chair, and I look very much look forward to hearing the testimony of our witnesses.
Thank you. I'd like to invite Representative Roy, the ranking member on the Subcommittee on Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, for an opening statement.
I thank the Chair. Around the world, the United States is a beacon for religious freedom and tolerance. And to quote our current president, our founders understood that no right is more fundamental to a peaceful, prosperous, and virtuous society than the right to follow one's religious convictions. The founders saw religious liberty as an indispensable pillar for our system of limited government. Jefferson, in drafting the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, which I'm required to quote as a graduate of the University of Virginia, knowing that, of course, it was so important to him that it was on his tombstone, along with being father of the University of Virginia, I might add. It read, quote, "We, the General Assembly of Virginia, do enact that no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever, nor shall be enforced, restrained, molested, or burdened in his body or goods, nor shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or belief, but that all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinions in matter of religion, and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities." This, of course, formed the basis of the First Amendment, as we're all aware. And while our Constitution offers these protections from government, it also forms the checks throughout the federal, state, and local governments that in practice protects each American from religious persecution. So while some countries provide constitutional protections for religious freedom, there are still egregious examples of persecutions worldwide. For example, Christians are persecuted at alarming rates. Indeed, Christians are the most persecuted religion. Every day, 11 Christians are killed for their faith. And in 2018, 245 million Christians were living in places with high levels of persecution. This, unfortunately, is often shown through incredible acts of violence. In 2015, we witnessed one of the most horrific acts of Christian persecution when 30 men wearing orange jumpsuits were taken down to the beach by Islamic terrorists in Libya. This horrendous act was recorded, and the footage was released for all to see. Masked men exclaimed, "To the nation of the cross, we're back again. Muslim blood that was shed under the hands of your religion is not cheap." Later, another militant said, "Those who convert to Islam are safe. Those who refuse, we don't have anything for them but the sword." That day, 30 Christian men were slain for their faith in Christ and refusal to deny him. Ironically, violent acts of religious persecution have at times had the opposite effect of those intended by those terrorists. Some individuals choose to convert religions upon acts such as this. One 23-year-old who attended a local Christian church in Kobani, a city on the Syrian-Turkish border, converted saying, "If ISIS represents Islam, I don't want to be a Muslim anymore." An Iraqi woman, Karia Al-Isaac, 54, is one of a rising number of Christian refugees to escape over the border to Kurdish-controlled territory with tales of how they narrowly escaped with their lives after they refused to convert to Islam. Weeping as she recounted her ordeal, Karia said she and her husband awoke on the morning of August 7th to find that Caracas had been overrun by ISIS fighters. She was told repeatedly from militants who spoke different languages from the first day that if she did not convert, she would be decapitated. When she refused, she and 46 women who had also rejected such demands were separated from their families and whipped and beaten over a 10-day period in an attempt to make them abandon their Christian faith. Karia said, "I answered the terrorists immediately. I was born Christian, and if that leads me to death, I prefer to die a Christian." Quoting from the Gospel of Matthew, she said, quote, "Jesus said, 'Whoever denies me before men, I will also deny him before my Father who is in heaven.'" At the root of the Christian faith is free will, to follow Christ or not, and that is the essence of religious liberty. And I stand with those Christians. I'm in awe of their incredible courage as they stay committed to their faith in the face of torture and death. I would like to think I would do the same. And I also stand with those facing similar persecution in other faiths. During my time here in Congress, I've traveled to Israel. I've been there twice, where I've seen up close the devastation brought upon the state through anti-Semitic behavior. Hundreds of thousands of rockets are literally pointing at Tel Aviv and Jerusalem as we speak. Recently, we heard Iranians chanting death to Israel at a procession for Qasem Soleimani. We heard the same chants at a rally in Iran's capital in 2018, marking the 39th anniversary of the United States Embassy takeover, where 52 Americans were taken hostage by Iranians for hundreds of days. Though global laws that lead to religious persecution is the focus of today's hearings, I remind my colleagues and those here today that this is not just a problem we see abroad. For instance, in Airmont, New York, the local government is currently discriminating against Orthodox Jews who seek refuge in neighbors' homes during Sabbath to pray together. For a reason the Founding Fathers cannot fathom, the government there is requiring permission to be granted to Orthodox Jews to worship in their homes, often their only choice for a place to worship on the Sabbath. This permission can be granted after a substantial and burdensome application process that often costs tens of thousands of dollars. But we also see erosion of religious freedom right here in the federal government. For example, one Texas company is currently fighting to keep their trademark license because they print biblical versions on dog tags for the military. And even within the walls of Congress, we have witnessed members, particularly in certain Senate confirmation hearings, flirt with protections of Article 6 of the Constitution by holding personal religious beliefs against individuals based on personal writings expressing their faith. A goal of mine is to allow this hearing to signal to anyone who has suffered or is suffering at the hand of this government, of his government, that the United States is committed to standing with those persecuted and hold accountable those that violate international religious freedom. I look forward to hearing from all our witnesses today and continue to bring other countries in line with America's great history of protecting religious liberty. Thank you, ma'am.
It's my understanding that Mr. Meadows has asked for a courtesy minute, which of course I'm happy to grant.
I thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank your courtesy, and I thank your leadership. I'm here, as all of you, you have a million different places you could be, but I want it to be really emphasized that this hearing is so critical. It brings people from the left and the right, from Democrats and Republicans together, because it is such a critical message that has a real impact on lives around the globe. And so I want to thank the chairman. I want to thank her for her leadership, not just this Congress, but each and every Congress. I want to thank my good friend, Mr. Raskin, for his leadership on this issue. Obviously, Mr. Smith and I go way back on this issue that's so near and dear to our heart. And for us, Miriam Ibrahim is a living example of what you can do when you come together, because I was able to actually hold her baby in my arms when she escaped religious persecution in Sudan. And so it's real personal for all of us. And I know we have her friend here in the audience, and so Ann Basham is here on her behalf today. But I would ask, Madam Chair, if I could submit Miriam Ibrahim's statement
objection
for the record in support of the resolution, and I yield back, I think, for the courtesy.
Absolutely. I'd now like to introduce our witnesses. Rachel Dyke is a legislative and social justice manager at the American Humanist Association. She advocates for public policy and policy implementation that is inclusive. Rachel has a background in national politics, advocacy, and strategic communications at the federal and state levels. And as I understand it, you are going to be speaking on behalf of Rafida Bonya, who I believe flew from London to be here with us today only to get sick when she arrived. So we certainly wish her well. Francisco Bencosme is the Asia Pacific Advocacy Manager at Amnesty International. Francisco has provided media commentary on multiple outlets, including the New York Times, Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal. In 2018, Francisco was named one of the Hill's top 2018 lobbyists for Amnesty International's campaign on the Rohingya issues. Before joining Amnesty International, he served as a professional staff member on the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where he assisted Democratic senators on issues related to East Asia, South Asia, the State Department, and USAID. Rushan Abbas is the founder and executive director of the Campaign for Uyghurs. Since 2018, she has been conducting a series of advocacy campaigns on the Uyghur cause, regularly appearing on media outlets to advocate for the Uyghurs, and gives public speeches in universities and think tanks to increase support for various non-Uyghur communities around the world. She has introduced and led the One Voice, One Step Uyghur Women's Movement and successfully organized a demonstration on March 15th in 14 countries in 18 cities to protest China's detention of millions of Uyghurs in concentration camps. Jeremy Barker serves as the Senior Program Officer and Director of the Middle East Action Team for the Religious Freedom Institute. He assists with the programmatic objectives of both the Middle East and International Religious Freedom Policy Action Teams, including research, writing, and advocacy with a focus on the Middle East, and provides program development and management support for the Religious Freedom Institute's action teams. Jeremy has lived or worked in the Middle East since 2010, including multiple years in Turkey and northern Iraq. We appreciate all of you for being here today and look forward to your testimony. Let me remind the witnesses that your written statements will appear in the hearing record, and under Committee Rule 6, each witness should limit their oral presentation to a brief summary of their written statement. And you will notice from the lights that when the light is yellow, you'll have a minute. When the light is red, you should end your testimony. Ms. Deutsch. Your microphone.
Thank you. My name is Rachel Dyke. I am one of the 1.1 billion individuals around the world,
Speak a little louder.
I can do that, who counts themselves as non-religious. I am also the policy manager at the American Humanist Association and will be sharing Rafida Bonya Ahmed's remarks that she had prepared for today's hearing. Unfortunately, she woke up this morning too sick to be here and sends her regrets. Chairwoman Bass, Ranking Member Smith, members of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations, Chairman Raskin, Ranking Member Roy, members of the Oversight and Reform Subcommittee on Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, thank you for this opportunity to testify on behalf of the American Humanist Association concerning the harm caused by the numerous prohibitions against blasphemy that exist around the world. Ms. Ahmed is a humanist, atheist, and Bangladeshi-American author and blogger. She intended to be here today to provide a much-needed voice for the non-theist communities and individuals harmed by religious persecution. Rafida's husband, Ovijit Roy, was also an atheist, a blogger, a writer, and above all, a humanist, who tried to answer the larger questions in life. Two of his books, titled Philosophy of Disbelief and Virus of Faith, made him exceedingly popular among progressive readers and simultaneously fueled hostility toward Ovijit from religious fundamentalists who added his name to a list of non-religious bloggers to attack and kill. They vowed to kill one a month. In February 2015, Ovijit and Rafida were visiting Bangladesh, their home country, for a book signing event at a book fair. On the 26th of the month, when they were leaving the well-lit, crowded fair, Ovijit and Rafida were attacked by Islamic militants and stabbed repeatedly with machetes. The area was surrounded by police officers, video cameras, and thousands of people. Nobody came to help them. Ovijit died in the hospital, and Rafida was gravely injured as a result of 4 stab wounds around her head, among other injuries, including her thumb, which was sliced off. Ovijit was perhaps the most prominent victim of religiously motivated violence in Bangladesh targeting non-theists. But he was neither the first nor the last such victim of a culture of impunity in Bangladesh buttressed by its blasphemy laws. The systemic pattern of assassinations and attacks were directed at atheist bloggers, LGBTQ activists, foreign nationals, and minority Shiites, Hindus, and Christians. Many have had to flee the country to save their lives. But Bangladesh is not unique. Blasphemy laws, as they exist in more than 80 countries, are used to justify the persecution of religious minorities, political dissidents, women, and LGBTQ communities. However, humanists believe that human-made problems require human-devised solutions, which is why the American Humanist Association leads a coalition of more than 60 national and international faith-based, non-theist, and religious freedom advocacy organizations in strong support of House Resolution 512. The resolution, introduced by Representatives Raskin and Meadows, calls for the global repeal of blasphemy, apostasy, and heresy laws, and is an important step toward holding faith-based vigilantes accountable. Congressional resolutions are taken seriously on the international stage. They carry weight, and this resolution in particular would send a clear sign to the world that these egregious violations to human rights will no longer be tolerated. But the opportunity to lead is now upon us. Momentum is growing, and increased international scrutiny already has spurred some countries, such as Canada and Ireland, to repeal their blasphemy laws. Passing this resolution now will build on the existing momentum and stimulate the positive change so needed. Ovijit once wrote, "Those who think victory will be realized without any bloodshed are merely living in a fool's paradise. We risk our lives the moment we start wielding our pens against religious bigotry and fundamentalism. Today, on Bonya's behalf, I ask you to take up the cause of those armed only with pens. We all must have the right to examine, question, criticize, and write, free from the culture of fear propagated by blasphemy accusations and other forms of religious persecution. I thank you again for convening today's hearing and for the invitation you extended to Ms. Ahmed to testify on behalf of humanists, atheists, and the non-religious. The American Humanist Association looks forward to continuing to work with Congress to ensure the rights of people from all faiths and none are protected. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ben-Cosme.
Madam Chair, Chairman Raskin, Ranking Member Roy, Ranking Member Smith, and other distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify at this timely hearing. For the purpose of this hearing, I will focus on 3 countries, China, India, and Pakistan, but touch on several other countries in my written statement. This past year, in the Asia-Pacific region, we have seen religious repression, but also resistance. Asia's 2 largest and most powerful states are trying to impose their own bleak, domineering vision on the continent, perceiving religious minorities as a threat to national security. In China, Beijing continued to tighten its grip on Christians and Muslims as China pushed ahead with the sanitation of religion, where any Buddhist and Taoist temples and statues, along with mosques and churches, were damaged or destroyed on the direction of the government. The authorities jailed religious leaders who were not recognized by the party for endangering state security. For example, on December 30th, Pastor Wang Yi of the Early Rain Covenant Church was sentenced to 9 years for illegal business operation and inciting subversion of state power. We also saw this in Xinjiang, where the crackdown of Turkic Muslims intensified as the true horrors of the re-education camps became apparent. I'm inspired by the courage of my colleague Rushan Abbas, who's testifying before Congress, Johar Ilham, who last year raised the issue with the president and whose father remains in prison, and Rabia Kadir, who the Chinese government recently used videos of her family as a way of threatening and intimidating her to stop her campaign, and she is here in the audience. These inspirational women and many other Uyghurs have traveled the world in helping build international awareness on the plight of the Uyghurs, oftentimes at a high personal toll. We also saw this in Kashmir, India's only Muslim-majority state, which saw its special autonomous status revoked, and in its place, a siege imposed that continues to this day. The country this past year topped the world in the number of internet shutdowns. The Indian Parliament also passed the Citizenship Amendment Act, which legitimizes discrimination on the basis of religion and stands in clear violation of the Constitution of India and international human rights law. The amendments are completely oblivious to the nature and scale of persecution faced by minorities in their neighboring region, and their structure and intent are discriminatory. The government of India has said it wants to start a nationwide national registry of citizens, which will document the citizenship of more than 1.3 billion people in the country. This exercise was recently concluded in Assam in India, which resulted in the exclusion of more than 1.9 million people. They're trying to weaponize the NRC process against Muslims. If implemented, this stands to create the biggest statelessness crisis of the world, causing immense human suffering. However, the bright flames of peaceful protests were sparked across India, where millions came out on the streets against the law. Protests have occurred against the Citizenship Amendment Act in at least 94 districts across 14 states. There's been deaths of at least 31 people related to violence, and more than 110 have been arrested, and more than 600 have been kept in preventive detention. In Pakistan, the blasphemy laws continue to be used to persecute individuals and enable human rights abuses. Armed groups carried out attacks on religious communities and sectarian organizations, incited hatred against religious minority groups with impunity. In September, Natulal, a school principal in Gokti, was charged with blasphemy after a mob riled up by a religious leader vandalized a local Hindu temple and attacked properties owned by the Hindu community. The blasphemy laws create an environment in which some people, including complainants and their supporters, believe themselves entitled to take the law into their own hands, with violent mobs attacking the accused while the police stand aside. Even if a blasphemy-accused defendant makes it to court, there are serious security and fair trial concerns that all but guarantee a wrongful sentence. Convictions despite weak evidence, delayed appeals and acquittals, and ongoing security risks makes the blasphemy laws in complete contravention with freedom of religion. So thank you, this committee and both committees for continuing to raise these issues.
Thank you, Ms. Abbas.
Thank you for giving me the platform to testify about the unprecedented atrocities that are being committed against my people by the Chinese Communist regime under the guise of fighting Islamic extremism. The Chinese Communist Party has carried out a brutal campaign to extinguish Uyghur people. The goal of the incredibly intrusive surveillance and iron-fisted social control forcefully wipe out the Uyghur identity and religion. Since early 2017, the Chinese government has incarcerated Uyghur Muslims while populating vast concentration camps with barbed wire and armed guard towers. My homeland has become an Orwellian police state where more than 3 million Uyghurs are detained in the concentration camps. The few survivors' reports emerging from the camps describe an alarming series of crimes against humanity, including intensive political indoctrination and inhumane conditions, torture, and the deaths in custody. Uyghurs are forced into modern-day slavery. More than 500,000 Uyghur children have been sent to government-run orphanages and forced to abandon their Uyghur identity and swear loyalty to CCP. The streets are filled with cameras equipped with facial recognition, roadblocks and police checkpoints around every corner, and GPS tracking devices on every vehicle, and QR scanning codes on every Uyghur homes. The CCP is orchestrating mass rape of Uyghur women who are forced to share bed with Han Chinese men while their husbands are in the camps. According to China's official newspaper, 1.1 million Chinese cadres have been deployed to Uyghur homes to live with them. With these forced assimilation policies carried out by the Chinese government, Uyghurs are imprisoned in their own homes, and Uyghur women are facing sexual abuse. Today, Islam has been outlawed. All normal religious activities are banned, labeled as extreme and toxic. The Chinese government announced openly that they will rewrite Bible and the Quran to reflect Communist Party agendas. How in the world, in any religion compatible with communist ideologies? The Chinese government is building crematoriums for the culture that doesn't practice cremation. The last time the world saw crematories and the concentration camps together was during the Holocaust. I decided to expose the atrocities, the faith of my in-laws, and the conditions of the camps. Then 6 days after my speech, as retaliation by the Chinese government, my sister, Dr. Gulshan Abbas, was abducted and became a victim due to my activism here in America as an American citizen. The CCP disguises these concentration camps under the euphemism of vocational training centers, but surely a person like my sister, a skilled professional medical doctor, doesn't need any training. She's a thoughtful, caring, and an amicable soul. She retired in early age due to her health conditions. I am extremely worried for her, as I have no information on her whereabouts for almost 17 months now. The recently leaked Chinese government documents are the evidence for their crimes against humanity. So the real question now is, how much longer will we have to wait until implement the Global Magnitsky Act against the Chinese officials who are responsible? We need to take tangible action to hold China accountable. I have to wonder whether the number of the people in the concentration camps would have reached millions if the world would have acted earlier, when Uyghur intellectuals like Yalkun Rozi and Raila Dawood were among the first ones to imprison. But the world has failed to act even now, when there are over 3 million are in the camps. By waiting so long to act, China has managed to commit every act in the 1948 Genocide Convention. The world is not only turning a blind eye to technologically enabled mass violations of the rights, allowing the continuation of inhumanity, but it's actively investing in China's Communist Party-controlled companies. China's also getting rewarded with the privilege of hosting the Winter Olympics 2022, an event where people should come together to celebrate their differences. To say the least, Beijing does not respect those values and instead trembles them holding millions in concentration camps because of their ethnic identity. Will we be able to uphold the vow never again with the real actions, or shall we sadly witness a repeat of 1938 Munich Pact as countries around the world avoid acknowledging Nazi Germany's human rights abuses for the sake of economic trade at the cost of millions of lives? However, then, access to information was slow, and the excuse to lack of the action was ignorance. However, this is 21st century. Ignorance is not excuse anymore. The faith of freedom and democracy of our world is at stake here. We are all responsible for what happens next. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Abbas. Mr. Barker.
Chairs Raskin and Bass, Ranking Members Smith, distinguished members of the committee, thank you. It's an honor to appear before you today. My testimony in brief is this. Religious freedom is a precious and fundamental right. It is facing a global crisis, one for which the United States should prioritize an all-of-government response. The scale of religious persecution is staggering. As my fellow witnesses have testified, it impacts real individuals and communities in devastating ways. According to the latest figures from the Pew Research Center, more than 55 countries with a combined population in excess of 6 billion people have high or very high level of restrictions on religion. These restrictions result in societies rife with religious inequalities. Religious freedom produces precisely the opposite effect. Grounded in the dignity of every human person, religious freedom includes the right of all persons to believe, speak, and act, individually and in community, in private and in public, in accord with their understanding of ultimate truth. As articulated in the First Amendment, Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and in contemporary research, religious freedom is understood to be a fundamental human right, the cornerstone of a successful society, and a source of national and international security. I'll focus the balance of my time on 3 trends and then offer a few recommendations. Perhaps the greatest threat of religious persecution, both at present and for the foreseeable future, is authoritarian regimes at the helm of technology-aided surveillance states. China has laid out a blueprint for government repression of religion through its use of emergent technology and artificial intelligence. The victims of this oppression include Tibetan Buddhists, Falun Gong practitioners, Chinese Christians, and in perhaps the most egregious violation of religious freedom taking place at present, the Uyghur Muslims, including the more than 1 million detained in so-called re-education camps because their religious beliefs and identity have been labeled a security threat. The Chinese government is refining these practices domestically and actively seeking to export this technology for use by other governments. These tools of repression facilitate otherization, denial of rights, and targeting of citizens because of their religious identity or beliefs. These patterns throughout history have been precursors to mass atrocities and genocide, including the 2017 violence against Burma's Rohingya Muslim community. A second trend is violence by non-state groups, such as terrorist organizations, quasi-official armed actors, such as the Iranian-backed Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, or vigilante mob violence, often facilitated by inept or complicit governments who are unable or unwilling to protect their citizens or pursue meaningful accountability, thus creating a culture of impunity. This trend is at work in Iraq, where the Christian and Yazidi communities are on the brink of extinction. Only small percentages of the 400,000 displaced Yazidis and 120,000 Christians have returned to their traditional homelands in Sinjar and the Nineveh Plains. These areas remain insecure due to the presence of ISIS and Iranian-backed militias. The government of Iraq, now facing massive protest in Baghdad, has failed to ensure the security of these communities, address corruption, or sufficiently address the sectarian nature of politics that has marked the country since the toppling of Saddam Hussein in 2003. These protests are a sign of hope as they are calling for a more inclusive and representative government for all Iraqis. While the dynamics may differ, similar trends of violent persecution and ineffective governance are at play in Syria, Yemen, and elsewhere across the Middle East, including Egypt's Sinai region and parts of Upper Egypt. Another hotspot is sub-Saharan Africa, particularly the Sahel region, where some of the most violent religious persecution in the world is currently taking place. A final driver of global religious persecution are blasphemy laws. These policies link state and religion in such a way that government becomes the arbiter of what is right religion. These laws are often weaponized against religious minorities, disfavored members of majority religions, and atheists or non-believers. In addition to prison terms, including the potential of the death penalty in some cases, these laws often inspire other types of violence as well. As my colleague Naile Saya documents, states that enforce blasphemy laws experience nearly 6 times as many terrorist attacks as countries without such laws. Let me turn briefly to the role of the United States. Since the 1998 passage of the International Religious Freedom Act, religious freedom has been mandated by law as a component of U.S. foreign policy, creating, among other things, an ambassador at large in the Office of International Religious Freedom. There are a number of tools made available to combat religious persecution and promote religious freedom. While there have been successes, including the work of current Ambassador Sam Brownback, there remains a need for an elevated commitment to utilize those tools as part of an all-of-government effort. Given the jurisdiction of the subcommittees, consider the tool of foreign assistance. Each year, the State Department expends tens of millions of dollars on explicit programming for religious freedom. In 21 years of IRF policy, has there been a public accounting of the impact of those efforts? What indicators are being tracked? Are those programs reaching their intended goals, such as challenging the abuse of blasphemy laws? Consider humanitarian and development assistance expended to meet acute needs in conflict or crisis settings. Are those efforts paying sufficient attention to the particular vulnerabilities faced by religious minority communities? Our research indicates that, unfortunately, the answer is no. Until that happens, the efforts to address these challenges will remain isolated acts of compassion and heroism, but insufficient to address the full scope of the challenge. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all the witnesses, and now we'll begin our 5 minutes of questioning on each side, and then once we have completed a round, if members want to speak again, there'll be the opportunity to do that, and I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I'd like each of you to respond to this. You know, the United States, in spite of our own contradictions here, has long been viewed as a beacon of human rights and pushing for human rights, you know, around the world and religious freedom. And given the rise of Islamophobia, as well as what is happening as recently as last week, the administration saying that certain countries were going to be banned from visas, it is perceived as a Muslim ban, regardless of if they're non-Muslim nations on the ban. So given that, how, you know, what does that do to the struggles in each of these countries? And maybe each of you can respond. Given our policies here, what impact is that having? And not just our policies, the general environment. Ms. Deutsch?
Thank you for the question, Chairwoman. I think that the United States has a long history of aspirations. We aspire to be a country that preserves freedom of speech, freedom of religion. And while I think we see the challenges of today as they are reflected in the international community, right? We are seeing people take note when those limitations and the increased damaging rhetoric that we might see, we see the problems that those might cause, right? And we see that the other foreign nations are taking note. So I do think that we need to lead with our values. We need to preserve freedom of religion, which
Yeah, I'm
demands—
real clear about the aspirational nature, even going back to the framing of our Constitution where we talked about religious freedom, but yet kept people in bondage for over 100 years.
Sure.
My question is, what impact specifically is that having? And Mr. Ben Cosme, thank you for your...
Thank you for that question. I think the first Muslim ban and every iteration after that undermines our credibility in our leadership on religious freedom issues. Even as much as Secretary Pompeo, Vice President Pence would like to speak about religious freedom, if the highest levels of the government continue to push for rhetoric around the Muslim ban or any version of it, it makes our credibility on these issues ring hollow.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Ms. Abbas?
For Uyghur people right now, it's about survival and existence. So the United States government is working toward leading the world, the Western democratic countries, to end the atrocities and close the concentration camps. So the administration and the government has to be more active and taking actual action instead of just some.
And, you know, I mean, China's a real issue. I started off my morning with a hearing on fentanyl, and knowing that fentanyl and the analogs are produced in China and shipped over here and Mexico, but yet, you know, we have tariffs on China because we're worried about trade issues. You know, we threaten the government of Mexico around immigration, but yet we can't figure out how to stop the manufacturing of fentanyl. We can't figure out how to stop the concentration camps with Uyghurs. So it just seems like one of the issues is, you know, while we press other countries, we need to press here for our political will, because how can you stop on one hand and worry about trade and not worry about people in concentration camps? Mr. Barker?
Yes, I think it's an important question that if it's you can't sell abroad what you've lost at home, and so threats to religious freedom here domestically, whether that's to the American Muslim community, what's happening to the American Jewish community, or even Orthodox Christians facing pressure, it does undercut our ability to advance those principles abroad. I think there are many in our government who do get this. Ambassador Brownback in particular has been a champion, as Ms. Abbas said.
Oh, he sure must be having a hard time.
For the Uyghur Muslims, but also the Rohingya and others. But so it is important that throughout our government, our foreign service officers, that they understand the meaning and value of this issue and how it affects global affairs.
Thank you. Mr. Smith?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you all for your testimony. Let me just begin. I do have a fentanyl bill that has been sitting in this committee all year. I hope, and last year. I hope we can get that out for consideration. We've had hearings on it too, like you have, Madam Chair. Let me ask you a couple of questions. I would ask unanimous consent that an op-ed that I wrote for the Washington Post, "The World Must Stand Against China's War on Religion," be made a part of the record. Madam Chair?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Objection.
I appreciate that. I start off with talking about Miracle Tursun, who said she pleaded with God to end her life as her Chinese jailers increased the electrical currents coursing through her body. Tursun, a Muslim Uyghur who escaped, led her to the United States in September of 2018, broke down weeping at a hearing that Marco Rubio and I co-chaired, and she talked about what it was like in a re-education camp. Absolutely appalling, doesn't even do justice to what she and so many others to this moment are facing. I too hope that global Magnitsky will be imposed upon those who are singled out. Frankly, I think it should start with Xi Jinping. His Sinization campaign, not just against the Uyghurs, but against the rest of China, is almost without precedent. It's reminiscent of Mao Zedong's attempt to crush religion. He wants to either co-opt it, or if that doesn't work, crush it. So thank you for putting that in. Let me ask you a question, and Ms. Abbas, know how much all of us on both sides of the aisle care deeply for what's happening to your sister and so many others and family members, including Radio Free Asia journalists who find themselves, all their family, rounded up and sent to these hideous concentration camps. And as the New York Times reported, all of this is at the direction, right from the very top, of Xi Jinping, the dictator of the People's Republic of China. Let me ask you, I think it should be put on the record that in the past 2 summers, there have been 2 very important religious freedom summits. Secretary Pompeo led them with Ambassador Brownback, and China was absolutely front and center, as were other gross violations of human rights, religious freedom. So there is an attempt, I think. Brownback has, they just released, as you know, the CPC listing. I wish that India was on that. I also had hoped that Turkey under Erdogan would be on that for what he has done. They were not as CPC countries, but we'll keep trying. Let me ask you a question, if I could. Largely invisible, when Anna Eshoo and I did the Iraq and Syria Genocide Relief and Accountability Act, took 3 years to get passed. I held 10 hearings on the invisibility of the Christian Yazidis who made their way into Erbil with no help from the United States government. Well, an ongoing part of the invisibility of those folks is the indifference, the hostility which Christians and Yazidi victims of ISIS are met when they go to refugee camps run by UNHCR in places like Jordan and Turkey. Alternatively, they've often avoided the camps because of ISIS radicals who are present in those camps. What is your assessment, and perhaps Mr. Barker or others would want to take this, of the UNHCR camps, and have you had the opportunity to look into the Christians and how they've been mistreated? 200,000, I think, should be able to come here. Certainly they should get the help and sustenance that they absolutely deserve by the UNHCR. We found this same problem as to why so many would not go, and they ended up in other places because they would be so maltreated. I do have a lot of questions, but let's start with that.
Sure. Yes, this has certainly been an issue of concern, and I know from the 10 or more hearings that you've held on this, Ranking Member Smith, that business as usual for our foreign assistance failed to take into account the vulnerabilities of religious communities. Whether that was through USAID programming, through the UN implementing agencies, or even international NGOs, over and over again, we saw religious minorities, both individuals and communities, overlooked in these assistance programs. And that absolutely is something that greater attention needs to be paid to, whether these programs are accomplishing the ends that they need, they exist to. If our foreign assistance exists to do anything, it would be to assist survivors of genocide. And yet, those communities were being overlooked, and it took intense effort and focused attention to make some progress on that, which much has been done in the last few years, but certainly the business as usual as foreign assistance was not meeting the vulnerability of those communities. And it's an issue in Iraq and Syria, but we look at other places, be that Burma, Sub-Saharan Africa, where you have similar dynamics at play. It absolutely is something that has to be addressed.
I see my time is up, but I would also point out, and I will follow up on this, part of the problem is that the people who adjudicate the cases at the local level, pursuant to UNHCR, they're hostile towards those individuals. Not in every case, but in so many. So they never get processed for third countries, like the United States or somewhere else. And I think that's a huge problem. It was a problem in Erbil as well. Yield back.
And we'll come back to you. Mr. Reskin.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I want to thank all the witnesses for their terrific and moving testimony. You describe conditions that are horrific in different parts of the world and experiences that are almost too painful to listen to, much less to go through. So I want to thank you all for doing what you're doing. I want to tell my colleagues a couple things. One is the resolution that Congressman Meadows mentioned that he and I have is called H.R. 512, which is calling for the repeal of all blasphemy and heresy and apostasy and sorcery and witchcraft laws all around the world, and to make this an important part of American foreign policy. So I hope people will check that out. And secondly, for those who are interested, you can adopt and champion a prisoner of conscience through the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. I did that with Brother Abdul Shakur, who's an Ahmadi Muslim and a bookseller in Punjab province in Pakistan. And at age 80, he was arrested and charged under the terrorism laws simply for distributing Ahmadi Muslim literature, which is against the law in Pakistan, which is considered a form of blasphemy. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison. I was able to join an international campaign to get him released, and after 4 years of pressure, he was released. And so, as somebody was saying before, I think it was Ms. Dyke, don't underestimate what even one member of Congress can do just by speaking out for a religious prisoner of conscience somewhere around the world. Let's see, Mr. Barker, I wanted to start with you. How much is it part of our current foreign policy to advocate for either endangered communities like the Uyghurs in China or individual prisoners of conscience who've been put on death row for blasphemy? Are we doing enough as a country?
Yeah. Well, I think part of the challenge has been that while we have great work done by the ambassador, by his office, the Office of International Religious Freedom, as Mr. Smith's talked about the ministerials that have been held, hosted by the secretary, it still remains a boutique human rights issue from our assessment and not part of a central pillar of our foreign policy as the IRFA Act, the Frank Wolf Amendment to that act mandate. And so there's steps still to be taken in the training of our foreign service officers, the way we use foreign assistance, our diplomatic engagements, our trade policies, and there's still much more, I think, that can be done to elevate it as a matter of policy. And so while there's successes, they remain isolated rather than mainstreamed.
Okay, and so you would advocate lifting it up and making it a more central part of our foreign policy?
Yes, sir.
Ms. Dyke, let me come to you. You spoke for a woman whose husband was killed as part of mob violence as the government of Bangladesh and the police basically sat and watched. And we know that there are other secularists who've been targeted under blasphemy laws and for mob violence, kind of in conjunction with various governments. What do you think the U.S. government can and should be doing, and what kind of campaign are you part of with the humanists to try to protect people in this situation?
Sure. So we believe that the Secretary of State should make religious freedom, as Mr. Barker just said, a higher priority in our diplomatic work within the State Department. We think the President and the Secretary of State need to be making religious freedom a priority across all their relationships. We also recommend that the President and within the blasphemy resolution, HRES 512, we also really support the call of the State Department and the President to ensure that no blasphemy law recommendations move on the international level within organizations like the UN and things like that.
In other words, to oppose the passage of new blasphemy laws?
Yes, thank you for that clarification.
Gotcha. Just say one more word about that, because obviously nobody encourages other people to aggressively insult other people's religion, and that's a dangerous way to go. But on the other hand, the blasphemy laws have been used as an instrument of religious persecution, discrimination, and oppression, right?
Exactly, yes. Religious minorities, non-theists, LGBT communities, women, all bear the greatest burden of blasphemy laws around the world.
Okay. I'm afraid that my time is out, so I will yield back to you, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Ms. Wild?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sorry, I've lost my place because I was too interested.
We should stop the clock or reset the clock till she...
Thank you. I was too busy reading the one of the testimonies. So.
You want me to come back to you? Or?
No, I'm ready. I'm ready to go. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. As a member of the Congressional Free Thought Caucus, I applaud that this hearing is happening and that there seems to be so much bipartisan support. I think it's an incredibly important issue. Yesterday was Holocaust Remembrance Day, and we so often say never again, but extermination of people around the world is happening every single day. We always think of the Holocaust as taking the lives of 6 million Jews or more, but we sometimes forget that it also took the lives of about 3 million Soviet POWs, about 2 million non-Jewish Poles, 300,000 Romanian gypsies, and I could go on. Many, many people were targeted for their sexuality, disability, race, and various religious persuasions. I am deeply concerned about religious persecution of many people of many faiths around the world. Ms. Abbas, I have to tell you that I have constituents who are Uyghur and who have parents in China who were removed to the so-called re-education camps. The last I heard from these constituents was more than 6 months ago. Their elderly parents, when they last had seen them, were ill and very much in need of medical attention, and who knows what's happened to them. So listening to you, my heart goes out to you. But these aren't isolated situations. It's very easy for us sitting here in the nation's capital and in this country to sometimes forget that this is happening around the world, and we can't forget it. It's worth noting that the Department of Commerce in October of 2019 put certain Chinese companies that surveil Uyghurs on an export blackout list. And this, I thought, was an important bargaining chip, and I hope the recently announced Phase 1 trade deal with China does not undermine that decision of the Department of Commerce. I think we need to use that type of negotiation and leverage around the world as we need to to make sure that these abuses are addressed. I want to turn to, before my time runs out, the issue of LGBTQ people around the world who are subjected to many forms of abuse, often in the name of religion. Anti-LGBTQ policies are often masked as promoting certain tenets of religion, as we know. And I'm particularly concerned, and I'm going to address this to Ms. Dyke, and please extend my sympathies to Ms. Ahmed. I read her testimony and was looking forward to meeting her. But on November 10th of 2019, we know that authorities in Uganda raided one of the only LGBTQ-friendly bars in Kampala, arresting approximately 125 people. More than half of those arrested were held in detention at a maximum security prison. And that followed an October 21st arrest of 16 men at a health charity that provides service to LGBTQ people, also in Uganda. Law enforcement subjected those men to forced anal examinations while in detention, obviously a tactic designed to shame and stigmatize them. And in early October, activist Brian Waswa was brutally murdered in his home. 2 transgender women were brutally attacked. I know Uganda is not alone on the African continent in terms of persecuting members of the LGBTQ community, but what I did want to know, and if you don't know the answer, if anybody does, are there countries on the continent that have overcome LGBTQ persecution, and how did they do so? And what can we do to continue to promote those human rights abroad?
I do not know off the top of my head, and I don't have my notes here, any specific examples, but I would be interested in hearing, and I can look at that information and try to get it to the committee.
If anybody happens to know, and if you don't know about the continent itself, if any help you can give us in continuing as members of Congress to make sure that we are promoting these human rights everywhere. Mr. Barker, any help here? Mr. Benscombe, thank you.
Hi, Congresswoman Wild. I think supporting LGBT civil society around the world makes a tremendous difference. When grassroots human rights organizations, particularly LGBT groups, are able to mobilize their own people to push their parliaments to pass laws that protect them. We've seen in some cases in the Asia-Pacific region where that's had success. And whether it's through litigation or advocacy from within, that's been really supportive. And so I would really commend Congress to make foreign assistance funding for LGBT civil society groups a priority.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
Ms. Wild, LGBT rights are a part of the Constitution in South Africa.
Thank you.
Mr.
Thank
Heiss?
you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate each of the witnesses for being here today. I will say during my time in Congress, I've considered the cause in the pursuit of religious liberty to be among the highest of callings personally, and I've authored and joined my colleagues in numerous letters fighting for the right of conscience and supporting those who are persecuted, religious minorities all around the world. Our first president, George Washington, so eloquently during the Revolutionary War made this statement. He said, "While we are contending for our own liberty, we should be very cautious not to violate the conscience of others, ever considering that God alone is the judge of the hearts of men, and to Him only in this case they are answerable." It's a powerful statement. I will say, both as a Christian and as a pastor for almost 3 decades before coming to Congress, I'm continually grieved by news of Christian brothers and sisters all over the world who are in harm's way simply for confessing through their lives or their lips the truths to which they hold and direct their lives. In 2013, German Chancellor Angela Merkel was mocked by the media when she said that Christianity was the most persecuted religion in the world. And of course, the data came out that bore true. In 2014, ISIS took over Iraq's 3rd largest city, Mosul, home of Christians for over 1,700 years. And basically there, Christians were given the choice to convert, to pay a religious tax, or to die. and many of them abandoned their homes and fled. In fact, the Archbishop of Mosul actually made this statement that has rocked me. He said, quote, "There are no human rights, but in Western countries, there are animal rights. In Australia, they take care of frogs. Look upon us as frogs. We'll accept that. Just protect us so we can stay in our land." What a powerful statement. In 2016, the Center for Studies on New Religions released a study reporting that over 90,000 Christians were murdered in 2016 alone, 30% at the hands of terrorists. And I'll say that today, not a whole lot has changed. For example, in Uganda, a family of 4 was set on fire and burned to death in their home for conversion to Christianity. In Egypt, 2 men were beaten to death for their Coptic Christian faith. In Nigeria, in separate incidents, over a dozen Christians were kidnapped and shot to death for their beliefs. In Cameroon, a man was killed for working as a Bible translator. Apostasy and blasphemy laws led to the imprisonment of 9 Christians in Iran, and similar laws in Indonesia led to Christian women being diagnosed as schizophrenic, and they were imprisoned for blasphemy. In Algeria, authorities closed and sealed 2 of the largest Protestant churches in that country, beating and dragging the congregants out of the church in the process. In Egypt, 2 of the largest churches were razed to the ground. Now, what's interesting, all these examples I gave happened just in the month of October of last year. So from the sanctuary of our First Amendment protections, we can only imagine what these people and people like these Christian minorities over the course of a year, over the course of 5 years, over a course of 10 years, what they experience. Being driven into hiding, fleeing from their homes, from their families, silenced by fear, losing their lives and the lives of their family members potentially. And we have, a great history here in this country, from JFK to Reagan, who've made it clear that America is a city on a shining hill. And I would just say the objective of statecraft cannot solely be on economic or military relationships. It can't be simply based on importing goods back and forth. It must also be focused on our beliefs, our ethics, our values around the globe. And I would just encourage this committee potentially to reach out to our Ambassador of International Religious Freedom, Sam Brownback. Perhaps he could come and we could take this hearing to another level. And in the meantime, I would encourage people all across this country to pray for not only Christians, but religious minorities around the world who are in harm's way because of their sacred beliefs of conscience. And with that, I'll yield back. Thank you.
And Mr. Heiss, we did actually talk about the ambassador earlier, and I would agree with you. We need to have him come forward because we want to make sure that he actually has the tools, since sometimes we send mixed messages about particular religions. Ms. Presley.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for your commitment to today's hearing and for affirming that our global community has a moral obligation to combat hate, bigotry, and white supremacy. While I sit here today listening to the testimony by activists, advocates, and survivors, I am sobered by the timing of it all. Just yesterday, we marked 3 years since the occupant of the White House imposed a racist, xenophobic ban on Muslims entering this country. We marked 75 years since the atrocity of the Holocaust robbed our world of 6 million Jews. As a Black woman and a woman of faith, I am saddened that as a nation we have grown so uncomfortable to hard truths and resistant to our own history, and because of this, we stand to repeat the mistakes of our past. Ms. Abish, thank you for sharing your painful and powerful testimony today. The mass internment of Uyghurs in China is a global disgrace. It mirrors the atrocities we see here in America, the world's leader in mass incarceration. A country which imprisons people simply because they worship differently should rightfully be condemned, but so too should a country that imprisons its own people for being Black, brown, or poor. United States does not stand on unblemished international moral high ground, and yet we must speak out. By most estimates, between 1 million and 2 million Uyghurs have been ripped from their families, separated from their children, and forcibly held inside of so-called re-education camps, or as I believe them to be, concentration camps. Ms. Abbas, I think we all know that a re-education camp is a grossly inaccurate description of what is happening. You have pointed out that the backgrounds, professions, and livelihoods of the disappearing people proves that these are not vocational training camps, as the Chinese government has claimed. Can you explain that further?
There are more than 500 intellectuals, university presidents, professors, famous writers, successful business owners. They don't need vocational training. Basically, the Chinese government is using war on terror, Islamophobia, and the name of the re-education or vocational training, incarcerating 1 to 3 million people. According to Randolph Shriver, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense, back in May 2019, about 3 million people are incarcerated now in the concentration camps. China is using the trade threats, debt trap diplomacy, and the power of the Belt and Road Initiative, and the manipulation in United Nations as the second largest donor, basically becoming the power able to strong-arm the world. So our administration and the government and our lawmakers urge all of you to act bravely, take action to stop this modern Holocaust, modern slavery right now that conducted by the Chinese government, because these Uyghur people are charged with no crimes. The only crime of my sister and the millions of the Uyghurs being incarcerated is because their ethnicity as Uyghurs and their religion, because they practice Islam.
Yes, and of those 3 million, your sister and your aunt were both placed in camps, correct?
My aunt was released 4 months later, but they both got picked up same day, 6 days after I spoke on the panel like this one. But my sister is still there in the camp.
All right, thank you, Ms. Abbas.
Thank you.
Last year, the New York Times revealed that Chinese authorities are using a vast secret system of advanced facial analytics technology to track and to control the Uyghurs, a form of racial profiling used to monitor the movements of an entire community in China. Meanwhile, there are reports that the Uyghur families that have not yet been in prison are too often forced to house a non-Uyghur man affiliated with the government, who shares a bed with a Uyghur woman, a power structure opportune for abuse and assault. Ms. Abbas, for the Uyghurs in China who are not imprisoned, what has daily life been like?
Basically, being Uyghur and being Muslim became illegal for our people. So everybody is facing persecution, not only the ones in the camps. Everybody's lives are being monitored and being called over to the checkpoints and every corner. And the plus, right now, people are facing to host non-Muslim, atheist Chinese people to live in and live with them in their houses. And the Uyghur girls are forced to marry Han Chinese because of the government gratifications, offering jobs, housing, cars, and the money. And they cannot refuse such a forced marriage, because if they do, then they will be labeled as Islamic extremists.
Thank you, Ms. Abbas.
Ms. Holland?
Thank you all so much for being here and speaking on this very difficult topic. Throughout history, individuals have been oppressed under the guise of religion. Our nation is not alone in this. The federal government promoted persecution of Native American ceremonies integral to the continuation of traditional and oftentimes matrilineal culture. While oppression reaches everyone, religious persecution often places harsher restrictions on women than it does on men. In Saudi Arabia, their guardianship system, justified on religious grounds, classifies women as legal minors, restricting their right to movement, to education, and to free association In Brunei, a new law under their Sharia penal code would allow stoning and amputation for same-sex relations and adultery. In India, Asifa Bano was abducted, gang raped, and murdered as a message to her Muslim nomadic community in Kashmir, and she was only 8 years old. I tell these stories because speaking out against hate and raising awareness of these issues gives voice to those who are forced into silence, and I just want to encourage all of you to keep speaking up. It's so easy for people to forget if it's not brought to their attention consistently. And throughout history, I'm reading this book on genocide right now, and it's easy for people to be in denial about what's really happening there. So I encourage you to keep speaking out to everyone, even when they won't listen, keep speaking out so that we will not be in denial about what's happening here. But I'm so grateful that you're all here today. I know it's a very painful thing to recount, and I'm just very grateful that you are here. My first question is for Ms. I don't know, I'm probably going to pronounce your name wrong. How do you pronounce your name?
Dyke.
Dyke. Thank you, Ms. Dyke. And the testimony that you gave on behalf of Ms. Ahmed was extremely compelling. And in that testimony, you convey that women often bear the greatest burdens of blasphemy laws because they can threaten the religious status quo. What did you mean by that, and how do women threaten the religious status quo?
Thank you for the question. I believe what Ms. Ahmed meant by that was that women are often oppressed in very extreme religious environments, and religion is too often used as a tool to justify violence against women. We've seen cases where women who opt to go to school, own businesses, leave their families, are said to be committing blasphemy or apostasy, or heresy, and are thus persecuted through blasphemy laws.
Thank you. And my next question is for you, Mr. Ben-Cosme. You're an expert on global blasphemy laws and religious persecution. Can you explain what effects religious persecution has on LGBTQ communities around the world?
Yeah, I think that unfortunately, so my expertise is particularly on the Asia-Pacific region, and I think we've seen instances in which the blasphemy laws in particular hurt minorities of the LGBT community and also women. There are cases where because of a person's religion or association that they can no longer, that they're often excluded. There's been, security forces have turned a blind eye to mobs who have targeted people, members of the LGBT community. You mentioned Brunei using, its sort of what we would call Sharia law that's incontrovertible with international human rights standards to impose basically the death penalty on LGBTQ communities. And we see that in various parts of the world.
Do you agree that USERF does not do enough in its research to analyze the intersection of religious persecution and LGBTQ rights?
I think that all of these institutions could be doing a lot more when it comes to the intersection of those issues.
And very quickly, what can we do here in Congress to protect our children, our sons, our daughters, and vulnerable minorities across the globe against this oppression?
Like you said, continue to speak out, join the Tom Lantos Commission, and endorse a prisoner of conscience and support them. Give the administration the tools and sort of require them to use those tools. Unfortunately, human rights is oftentimes pushed away for other national security interests. And so in order to be integral, it must really be made a priority. And within the interagency process, it must actually be enforced as a priority.
Thank you. I yield, Chairwoman. Thank you.
Mr. Grothman?
Yeah, first of all, just a general question. I had another committee to be at. When I think of horrific human rights or genocidal behavior, Of course, you think of Soviet Russia, you think of what happened in the Ukraine, you think of Nazi Germany, you think of Red China, you think of Cambodia, all atheistic countries. And as the result, it always kind of scares me if you have a wave of people or a move away from belief in a higher power. Maybe we'll ask Mr. Barker or somebody else to comment on, do you feel we are entering a more dangerous time in world history as perhaps more and more people are, or perhaps less and less people are acknowledging God? You could comment a little bit about the role of a lack of faith in God in some of the horrific mass murders throughout history, particularly in the last 100 years.
Yeah, well, I think as you pointed out, it's certainly been the case that you've had atheist or secular regimes that have overseen some of the...
Overwhelmingly.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at the number of murders in the last 100 years, it's almost all atheistic regimes. Isn't that true?
Yeah, I think that is right. And so, and there does seem to be a connection that I had my colleagues at the Religious Freedom Institute recognize between the flourishing of religion and other social and societal goods. As I mentioned in my testimony, we seem to see this connection in a number of places. And so any policies that restrict the practice of religion, I think, seem to be at least correlated with increase in violence of other kinds as well.
Yeah, with such horrific examples of atheistic totalitarianism in China, in Soviet Russia, and Cambodia, why do you think our popular culture seems to push the idea that the problem is religion?
Yeah.
Against overwhelmingly evidence the other way. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, it's. I'm not sure exactly the trend. Why you certainly see an affiliation with religious affiliation in the West, but globally, demographically, according to recent numbers from Pew, by 2050 there'll be an additional. The 23 times more religiously affiliated people than not, and yet there seems to be this kind of idea of juxtaposing religion as against human rights when the evidence certainly bears the other way. And so it's critical that both protected in law and respected in culture, that religion is enabled to flourish.
My religion happens to be Christian. I'm just kind of going through my papers here. And of course, Christian is the primary religion in probably Latin America, North America, Europe, some other places. I don't see a lot of persecution there. You want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think as far as for the primary trends that we look at, yeah, they do not, in many ways, seem to be Christian majority areas. They're certainly.
I mean, they are Christian majority areas,
yeah,
right?
Yeah. And so, yeah, that seems to be what the evidence is bearing out.
And would you draw any conclusions from that?
I mean, certainly, I would speak as a Christian that the principles articulated within Christianity would certainly lead to loving God and loving your neighbor, and when that's implemented throughout society, it would not lead to driving religious persecution. Trust that my fellow religionists around the world are also living out that mandate, but something that's there in other faith traditions as well.
Right now, and we'll ask the other three of you, thinking of I can't remember the name for it, the Bangladesh, Pakistan, India part of the world, and I'm, big supporter of those folks, but are there problems for Christians in all three of those nations? I mean, for whatever reason, Pakistan didn't show up on the list here. How are you treated if you're a Christian in Pakistan?
I will say that Christians as minorities in Bangladesh have been persecuted, and I will also say that according to a 2019 Pew report, what we found is that countries where Christians and Muslims are being persecuted, that number is actually declining, whereas the persecution of non-religious people is actually increasing. And with our numbers all over the world, 1 in 4 Americans are non-religious. 1 in 5 people around the globe are non-religious. We exist as part of every democracy, every government. Excuse me, and I think we're seeing actually a rise in persecution of non-religious around the world.
Thank you. Thank you. Votes have been called, but I'm going to go back to Mr. Smith for 5 minutes, and then we'll try to take a couple more before we adjourn.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you again, all of you, for your testimony. You know, Mr. Barker, in your testimony, you talk about how the menu of options have not been utilized against countries that have committed systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations of religious freedom, that the tools that are there have been minimally used. I share that concern. Under Bush, under Obama, and under Trump, you know, the people that get put on CPC, of the 10 in 2019, 4 got national security waivers when it came time to apply the sanctions, and the 6 remaining, their sanctions were double-hatted with something other than, you know, that they were already receiving. What could we do? As a matter of fact, when we did the bill, the Frank Wolf Religious Freedom Act, I was the prime sponsor, joined by Anna Eshoo, the principal Democratic sponsor, and a lot of other members. The idea was to integrate religious freedom into every aspect of U.S. foreign policy, explicitly stated in the law, require religious freedom training of all of our State Department and Foreign Service officers. Is that going well or not? And there are dozens of provisions, but on those 2 and any others you'd like to touch on, please do. And secondly, Mr. Ben-Skami, you mentioned the Rohingya, and that the International Criminal Court, the ICC, began an action in 2017. Maybe you could briefly update it on how that is going. So if I could go to Mr. Barker, then to Mr. Ben-Skami.
Yeah. Well, thank you, sir. Yeah, there certainly have been successes throughout, but I think you even mentioned that as a rejection of a visa, specifically on religious freedom grounds, as far as I know, it's only been 1 time in 21 plus years. That's just an example of a certainly underutilized tool. Things like the Global Magnitsky Act was used even in Iraq and Syria against militia leaders that were responsible for human rights atrocities. Ms. Abbas pointed to that as a potential tool that could be used in China. I would say, and Chairwoman Bass mentioned the idea of the ambassador coming to testify. As far as I understand, in 21 years, the authorizing committees of the Religious Freedom Act have not held a hearing on the implementation of that act. The Oversight and Reform Committee has held 2, but I may be wrong, but as far as I understand—
Gentlemen yield, I've held several.
On the implementation of the
act. Yeah, on the implementation, and raised concerns that during the Obama administration, they didn't even designate countries on CPC, and we heard, and then when Rabbi Saperstein came on board as the Religious Freedom Ambassador at large, he then made sure that that was done.
Very good. But yeah, increased reporting, particularly on the diplomatic side, but also the program expenditures, both the explicit religious freedom programming as well as things like our democracy and governance programming that goes to hundreds of millions annually. Is that being utilized to advance religious freedom, address blasphemy laws? Those sorts of things would be recommendations I might make.
It's worth underscoring that Gambia filed a petition at the International Court of Justice, and last week there was a decision that said that provisional measures need to be taken by the Myanmar government in order to prevent further acts of genocide from taking place inside the country. On the ICC specifically, they have determined that there is jurisdiction, but are still investigating further ruling. But it's limited in scope, only on deportation and not on other crimes that were committed. So it's really important for the U.S. to push for a Security Council vote on referral to the International Criminal Court.
Mr. Raskin.
Madam Chair, thank you so much. I'm sorry that my friend Mr. Grothman had to leave. I wanted to assure him that there's no reason for anyone to be defensive about the role that theocratic regimes have played in violating people's religious liberty. There's no reason to pretend that that's just the product of atheistic regimes. Clearly, the communist government of China has been a massive threat and danger to the Uyghur people, but we've seen lots of examples where every religion's name has been taken in vain by authoritarians and despots and violent dictators who want to use religion as a weapon of oppression against people. Massive crimes have been committed in the name of pretty much every religion. And churches have been used all over the world of various denominations for purposes of terror and child abuse and stealing from people, and you name it. So what we're talking about here, I think, is the defense of human rights, including the essential human right to believe as you will and to practice the religious faith that you want against any government that would take that right away from you. Our founders understood the critical relationship between the freedom to exercise religion and keeping government away from religion. That's why our Constitution has both a free exercise clause and an anti-establishment clause. Our framers didn't think it was enough to say everybody can exercise their own religious faith and then whatever happens with the government happens. No, they didn't say that. They said there shall be no establishment of religion. And they had seen in the colonies what took place when you had one religion take over, like the Puritans, the Congregationalists did in Massachusetts, and they hanged the Quakers and drove them out of Massachusetts, which is how they ended up in Rhode Island. And every colony ended up having kind of a religious character. Like my state, Maryland, was the Catholic state, and it put in its laws that Jews could not hold office and other religions were discriminated against and so on. So the founders of our country, when they wrote the Constitution, said there shall be no establishment of religion. This should be our great gift to the rest of the world. We've worked this problem out. We are a thriving, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious society, and the reason we thrive is precisely because we separate church and state. And we allow, as Madison said, the question of religion to be between each man or woman and his or her conscience, and not getting the government involved, not getting the state involved. That's what we've got to offer the rest of the world. So I guess I would simply close with the thought, Madam Chair, that we're in the 21st century now. And these are problems that our framers were trying to deal with back in the 18th century. And they viewed them as 14th century problems. It was about inquisition and holy crusades and trying to convert people by violence and coercion and force to religions. That doesn't work. That's a recipe for disaster. And yet in the 21st century, now we got the worst of both worlds. We've got a lot of that kind of religious fanaticism married to state power, and we've got 21st century means of technology to surveil people and to try to control people. And so the only thing that's going to beat it is mass movement around the world to defend people's freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, freedom of belief. And if America doesn't do it, who's going to do it? So the burden is on us. I just want to thank our witnesses, Madam Chair, for what they're doing and urge all of our colleagues to step up and to be serious about the importance of religious freedom and toleration and dissent all over the world. Without that, we are lost. I'm going to just move finally unanimous consent to include 4 letters from across the spectrum here into the record: the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, American Atheists, the Center for Inquiry, and the Freedom from Religion Foundation.
Without objection.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
As I mentioned earlier, votes have now been called, and so those of us who have the right to vote on the floor are going to have to leave and vote. I would like to invite, though, Representative Eleanor Holmes Norton, who represents the District of Columbia, that has the population of a few states, but does not have statehood, and therefore she is denied the right to vote on the floor. But I would invite her to take over the chair and continue the hearing. Thank you very much.
I thank the chair for explaining why I'm here. And I'm going to ask my own questions. ought to say H.R. 51 is going to the House floor shortly, and it's going to pass. It has more than enough co-sponsors to pass, so we're more than halfway there, I think, if we get this passed in the House. Should be nobody in the United States that doesn't have the same rights as everyone else. I'm interested in the threats to free speech. We understand, and this hearing has discussed religious persecution, very, very important. I was a free speech attorney. I've argued the First Amendment before the Supreme Court of the United States and value what free speech can mean in any society. So I'd like to begin with Ms. Abbas, because you have certainly exercised speech. Whether it's free is another question. You shared your story with us today, of course, before I came, and I understood what that story was. But about 24 of your husbands, Uyghur family, in China were missing, and yet you decided to speak out on a panel here in the United States. A mere 6 days later, as I understand it, your sister and your aunt disappeared. I don't know where they disappeared to. Why, if you were to ask, why did they disappear? What would be your answer? Because that's what I'm asking you now.
They became the victims for my activism or my exercising my First Amendment rights under the freedom of expression, freedom of speech here in America as a free American.
Yeah. So they were targeted because they were your family members. You have any idea where they are?
My aunt was being released 4 months later, but my sister, no, I have no information on her whereabouts and her health conditions. Has been 17 months now. I have no information.
You know, in this country, we speak about chilling free speech, but this is an attempt to kill free speech in a way I must say I've never heard before. Your courage is exemplary, outstanding. What impact does it have on others, you think, who may want to speak out, but see what happened to you and your family?
That's what the Chinese government wants.
What is what they want?
To look at me or people like me who are willing to come out and speak, and then their family members are being taken as a threat or hostage. But I have been speaking continuously after my sister and my aunt are being abducted. I hope that other Uyghurs abroad are also speak out, exercising their freedom of speech, because what the Chinese government is doing today, the persecution against the Uyghurs, are racially motivated, and the Chinese government's strategy to building the Belt and Road Initiative, the New Silk Road, is causing destruction in our homeland. Not only the 3 million Uyghurs are in concentration camps today, but none of the Uyghurs in abroad, none of the Uyghur Americans, they can communicate with their family members just using their phones or using internet.
They cannot.
They cannot. The Chinese government is using fear and taking people who are communicating with their relatives abroad to concentration camps. So just trying to scare people of speaking out. Yeah. Basically, China is changing the rule of law and making something like this, this kind of atrocity, the abuse of the human rights as a norm.
I'm not sure there are many like you. Seems to me one could argue just the opposite, that what happened to your relatives will intimidate people from speaking up. Do you think that's the case?
Yes, that's the case for many people. They are not coming forward and speaking out because they see people like me Their relatives are
Very
being
heavy
hostage.
retaliation.
Yeah.
Mr. Ben Cosme, same question. How does the persecution of religious minorities impact on the fundamental freedom of free expression, free association? We already understand about religion, free expression, free association.
Yeah, I think that often what we've seen and noticed is that freedom of religion and freedom of expression oftentimes go hand in hand. For example, not only in the context of China, but we've seen it in places like Indonesia, where former governor of Jakarta, for simply stating, something about religion, was then sentenced and imprisoned for over 2 years. You're seeing in places like Vietnam, where even just a social media post is creating an impossible task for religious leaders, and their property is being taken away, and many, worshipers are being detained. And so you're seeing that the two go very much hand in hand, and that any appreciation of human rights must support freedom of religion and freedom of expression as well.
Ms. Deutsch, Bonya and her husband were attacked because they were humanist writers and bloggers. They weren't speaking, they were exercising free speech in a classic way. As I understand it, they were visiting Bangladesh from the United States when they were attacked. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Is it fair to say that her husband was murdered for exercising free speech rights in an entirely different country?
Indeed.
Are there concerns about what would happen to Banva if she returned to Bangladesh in particular after her vocal activism?
I believe so.
You say what?
I believe so. Excuse me.
Mr. Ben Cosme, how does persecution of religious minorities affect freedom of assembly and association?
One example is that, to be very specific, Amnesty International, particularly Amnesty India, has been very outspoken on human rights hate crimes against religious minorities. And therefore, anytime Amnesty India participates or mobilizes supporters to go out and protest the Indian government, in the past we've seen raids against our office. We've seen state-friendly media sort of use the media to sort of attack Amnesty India, and also to sort of weaponize it against and say that we're in violation of state sovereignty and sort of a threat to the country. So we've seen freedom of association being used against us.
I can only say how what a service you have done, all of you, in testifying about the rights that were in our very First Amendment, the right to freedom of religion, the right to freedom of speech, the right to freedom of association. I think we will have a greater appreciation for those rights when we hear this chilling testimony from all of you. I want to thank the witnesses for sharing their testimonies to us. Really shockingly important testimony. You all have demonstrated the scale of the issue, which is so bothersome for us to hear, and why we have held this hearing today. I had another hearing, I had to run back and forth, as there were two important hearings today, but this hearing is a unique hearing as far as for my years in the Congress, because of what you've been willing to come forward and testify about. I do want to emphasize that this was a joint hearing with the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations, and the Subcommittee on Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. When you see that this was a joint hearing, perhaps that conveys or signals to you the importance of this issue to members of Congress. We intend to continue to focus on ending global religious persecution, and I might add, persecution in free speech and free association as well. May I thank the witnesses and all members who came today for being here. If there is no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.